I'm Sarah Wilson and you're listening to the Roots and All podcast. I'm here to help you get growing. Join me as I explore everything plant related both indoors and out and provide the information you need to create your perfect green environment. Hello and welcome to this episode of the podcast. This is the fourth and final part of the Design Expert series, and this week's guest is New Zealand-based garden designer Xanthe White, who runs Xanthe White Design, which has offices in Auckland and Wellington. This series has very kindly been sponsored by the London College of Garden Design, which is based in the UK at Kew Gardens, and they've recently launched the London College of Garden Design in Melbourne, based at the Royal Botanic Gardens, Victoria, so that may be of interest to Australian listeners. I know the college has managed to seamlessly move their teaching over to online during the lockdown, so a huge well done to them and to their students who are on track to graduate in the summer and will be in a position to hit the ground running once we're out the other side of this. As with the other episodes in the Design Expert series, we talk about the practicalities of running a design practice in the region, what the client-design relationship looks like, and the evolving face of garden design. I started by asking Xanthe about the beliefs underpinning her own practice.
So our design studio believes in that essentially that there is a landscape, like the wild landscape, and then the point where it becomes garden is where we interact with it. So when we look at design, we look at people. People are really an important aspect of that. And so culture and the individual that we're interacting with, we see as kind of part of the ecology of what we're creating. And we have a theory that our philosophy is not just about making gardens, it's about making gardeners and about making those human connections between the spaces we create and the people that we're working with. So as important as the space is how the space is going to speak to and interact with the people that are going to occupy it.
Mm-hmm. And do you work mainly in New Zealand or do you work internationally as well?
We've worked all around the world. We've done projects we've done Chelsea Gardens years ago, a couple of projects in Chelsea. We've worked in commissions in Japan and Singapore, Isle of Man, and we've also currently have some projects going on in China as well. So we've really had the opportunity to work in a whole range of places. We have a garden in Lequenois in France as well. So that I think working in other contexts is really interesting when you're a little island floating in the Pacific, or not floating, but kind of rising out of the Pacific Ocean, how you kind of define your relationship with the landscape when you see how it is in a continental scape and in different places is really, really interesting as well.
So when you say you kind of channel the individual into your work, does that mean that you're working mainly with domestic gardens or do you do public spaces as well?
So we do both private gardens and public spaces. One of our big projects at the moment is working with iwi, so with mana whenua, who like the local Māori community, of kind of like a family group would be, or a tribe would be probably a good way of describing it, who have a large piece of land in central Auckland, which the way it's managed is so the land is owned by the family, but most of it is open to the public, so public has access to large areas of it. So it's sort of an interesting scape because it's kind of park-like, but there's a lot of ecological restoration, a lot of cultural, different cultural kind of narratives determining the shape of the design. And so we've been working on the framework of that. So, yeah, it's a public space, but in that it has, I think the way to think about it is when you are looking at a piece of land that is owned by an iwi, which is one way that describes a tribe, it is the ability to think in length of time is massively increased. So when you're designing the landscape, when someone says to you, and how long will it take us to do this? And you say, well, some of it probably won't happen till we're all gone. And they say, wonderful. Whereas most people when you're looking at a massive project, and if you said to them, well, you won't be there, they'd probably be like a little bit annoyed by that. And so like this ability to think through generations is like a whole nother context in terms of how we view land, and the outcomes. What drives you when you're thinking beyond your own generation changes the way you think about design.
So you're designing landscapes to stand the test of time, really. And then I guess there must be some sort of built-in resilience to not change, but the way that it's managed over that time. Is that a consideration as well?
So essentially, the way we've approached the process is in terms of creating it like a visual framework. So there's vision and ideas and contexts about where the project will go, and these are driven by like lots of people's different ideas. And you know that some parts of the project are going to emerge in all these different sort of myriad of ways, but at the same time, it's almost like you're a catalyst for helping to bring a collective collaboration of ideas together to put action into the land. But when the actual each piece or part of a project occurs is kind of almost indeterminate. So it's you need to be able to think about the big picture and the little picture, but at the same time, it's really organic, which I think from a landscape point of view is a natural way to work, because we're always looking at our landscapes. We can never be finite in terms of their timeframes. They're never only just going to exist for they are going to, parts of it, we hope, will exist beyond our own lifetime. We hope that trees, the trees that we plant will live beyond us. And so, and yet there's like seasonal changes, and then the landscapes are constantly in these different fluxes. And so, the concept of time has got this fluidity to it. And so when you also have a group of people who can think in terms of like that long-term development and long-term processes, and you can say to them in the way, like I know, for instance, I think it might be Oxford Cathedral, I think the oak trees that were going to form the beams were planted when it was built, because they knew that they'd only last that sort of time, a certain time frame. So they had the trees that were big enough to replace the beams when the time came to replace them. They already knew where the trees were. And so we can plant trees that will build the new whananui, which is like the meeting house now, that won't be able to be harvested for maybe 100 years, but we can plant the trees for the next building. That sort of thinking.
Fantastic.
Is really wonderful in a landscape context.
Yeah, sounds it. And it actually is a sort of, from a practical point of view, I think there's probably designers listening who are thinking you're acting almost like a kind of coach or a trainer, I assume, at the initial stages, trying to coax out of people what they want and how they connect to the land and everything else. Is there somebody in your studio that does that specifically?
So listening to people is probably something that, in terms of the studio, that we teach all the designers to do. It's probably my primary role is to create the context of the design in terms of those first processes. So to identify what actually is this project, what is actually the drivers of this project, what are the outcomes that somebody wants to see come from this, and how do we frame our creative response and our understanding of the world and all of that context? How do we bring that to empower that person to create that thing, whether it's in like a very tiny little kind of small solution situation, or whether it's on the scale that we're talking hundreds of years of thinking and huge numbers of people that will be involved. And it's the same thing. It's about listening and understanding and seeing what people are telling you, and then using your creativity to kind of, and your knowledge and your experience and practicalities to pull those ideas together into something tangible that people can then drive forward. Because you have to give people a vision, you have to give them something that they see themselves in and that they feel confident and able to enact and to manage. It's like you can give somebody the most amazing thing, but if it completely intimidates them, it becomes meaningless. Whereas, so it's matching that. It's like the most flamboyant clients out there, you know that you can pull them further to the edge. You know, you can play with them and kind of, take, their limits are going to be far more risque and kind of, and also that normally in those situations the dialogue's going to be more intense, that you're not necessarily going to agree on everything because they're going to challenge you more, and they're not just going to accept some sort of painting by numbers formula that you pop out to them. They're the ones that you're going to really spin off, and so they're really exciting. But it's like everybody has their little framework that you need to listen and understand and then speak to.
To an outsider, it might seem that if your job is to channel the client's ideas and, make that reality, it might seem as if it would be easier if a client came to you with a really kind of well-formed concept in their head of what they wanted a garden to look like. But actually, by the sounds of your process, it might be better if they came to you with something as, kind of abstract as, I like the colour orange, let's work on that. Is there a good client in inverted commas?
A good client is someone who you get along with. I think it all comes down to human relationships at the end of the day. A good client, you need to trust each other. You need to be able to communicate with each other. So we're responsible as designers for a large part of that. You don't have to be besties or anything like that, but you have to trust and communicate. And that's the basis of the first part, is that dialogue that happens. And so the more open and receptive the client is to that, then that's when the magic happens. And so if from that very first meeting you meet someone, they might be the most wonderful person, but you can feel it if they don't make that connection with you, or they maybe the way, sometimes it's normally when it goes wrong, it's not because there's something wrong with the client or there's something wrong with you. Normally when it goes wrong, it's because sometimes it's like chemistry. Sometimes someone might just not get you. It might be the way, I'm quite a slow thinker. I'm not very good at just kind of slamming down 3 ideas right in the forefront, and I might take a while to get to the point because I like to understand things. But that might infuriate some people, and it doesn't mean there's anything wrong with me or them. It's just there's chemistry to design.
Yeah, definitely. So moving on to the actual kind of physical work, what are some of the biggest challenges that you face in New Zealand? Is it the climate or soil quality, water, pests and diseases? For example, I spoke to you and said that I interviewed Leon Kluger, and he said, one of his problems is stopping giraffes eating his new planting. I mean, that's something that we don't really have to deal with in the UK. But, what are your biggest challenges?
I think probably the biggest challenges has been we actually have it's actually not hard. Just trying to think, I find it quite easy. I find it's definitely a challenge being a woman, being on building sites where 80% of people are male. And I started out when I was quite young, and I would have builders talking to the guys that worked for me and not speaking to me. And, but I managed to kind of find ways of getting benefits out of that. I'd just let them carry all my stuff to my truck for me as well. So, you can kind of work these things around to kind of work in your favor as much as they hinder you. And, even if you end up having to work a bit harder, sometimes you're just it's okay to listen to me. So I think probably from a career point of view, those have been some of my biggest frustrations. And I think the way I had to overcome it was I had to learn how to use a spade. I had to learn how to use a skill saw. I had to be physically competent and able to speak their language and prove that I could get muddy and dirty with them, which I think not lots of my colleagues don't have to do that to the same extent that I have to do before people start talking to them or listening to their instructions. But I think the advantages of that mean that I actually know how things are built, which has been really awesome. So because I had to get in there and do it myself until someone took over it, it kind of meant that my construction knowledge is really strong. And so it's kind of like the difficulties have ended up feeding back. In terms of New Zealand, probably the most unique thing in our landscape and the biggest challenge for me as a designer is the fact that I'm a Pākehā, so my ancestors are from like Scotland and England and Ireland, and so that means that we were part of signing the treaty with Māori, and so part of that responsibility is kind of owning the fact that some of our culture, in terms of what my grandma brought me up with gardening, with lots of exotic plants and colour and food gardens and things like that, some of that is colonization, and it's like a cultural occupation of a land that used to be covered in these incredible forests with completely unique flora. And so there's this like constant awareness that when you're landscaping, you need to be really, really conscious of the plants that you're putting into that environment and how they can perpetuate and damage what was here before. This like really delicate and we've lost about, I think it's like 60% of our forests in the last 200 years, basically since my ancestors came up. It's like the devastation has been extraordinary. And so we have this continuous awareness of like the things that you love in our culture and things we love about gardening, the potential for that to be just actually being environmentally devastating. And then at the same time, it's also our culture. It's so part of who we are. And so there's always this kind of dialogue and conversation about how we treat the land and what plants are appropriate. So basically there's a cultural conflict in terms of how we make decisions with gardening. So there's a beautiful native flora, and that is like really precious. You know, from a world perspective, it's really scarce and it's really unique. So we've got this responsibility to preserve that. But when I was growing up, there was this real kind of divide between the people who, you know, were trying to preserve this environment, which is really delicate, and then people who gardening was really culturally important for them, and the way they'd formed the landscape with exotic plants was something their parents had worked hard for. And so one of the things we try to do with our work is look at ways of bringing those thinking together, like, because dividing it down the middle just meant that we would have some clients who would say, I hate native plants, I don't want any in my garden, because they sort of saw them as this thing that was enforced upon them, that they had to garden in a certain way. And it was, you know, it's cultural, and we're all, you know, gardening is culture. It's absolutely culture. It's passed down to us from our grandparents. It's associated with our memories. It connects us to the land in all these beautiful ways. And so we work really hard to try and preserve native plants, increase diversity, but also to acknowledge the culture that's passed down through our grandparents, but to do so in a way that's non-disruptive to the natural environment as well. So to do so in a way that is kind of so non-aggressive plants, and plants that are strong and beautiful, but also being considerate about where we put them in the natural environment as well. Like, you don't put them in a coastal environment where they can sort of spread and, you know, cause devastation to a delicate dune ecology, for instance. Whereas in a city garden where, you know, they're not going to seed, it's like, go for it, you know, beautiful, love it, you know. So that's probably the biggest challenge with our work, is understanding the environmental consequences that we have on the environment as landscapers and gardeners.
So you bring such a lot to bear in each garden. It's fascinating. So I guess one of my questions was going to be what inspires you, but I think maybe your designs are as much driven by the things that are input into them by kind of external factors that are not aesthetic. But if you do draw down from aesthetic inspiration as well, what is inspiring you right now?
Well, beauty is absolutely essential as a design tool to communicate ideas. Beauty allows people to accept things that they otherwise wouldn't accept. Some of my clients who've said, I hate natives, have been, a year later, I'll get an email saying, I looked up that plant in the garden. It was my favorite plant. You didn't tell me it was a native. And they're like utterly in love with that one little thing, because the way it's placed and the way it's treated, they're like, wow, and mesmerized by that. And so beauty is an essential tool in persuasion and on bringing people's thinking together and understanding together. And that's our role as a designer. We're not conservationists who are restoring land from that ethos, and we're not, farmers who are getting productive. We're communicators and beauty is the way it's kind of it's the bait to lure people into new ways of thinking and make them comfortable with, and realize that things are not threatening, and kind of softening people's ideas. And, we have some clients who are just like, they lack confidence of, I'm not a gardener. And it's like, but do you want to be? And how much of a gardener do you want to be? Do you just like kind of being out there and having two tasks to do, or do you actually want to be able to grow something? And so that's the beauty, is how you lure people in and their confidence. And I planted that, and oh my gosh, have you seen that? Or did you see? And that feedback cycle for people is totally part of the journey that you take people to make gardeners, because I can't garden that I've been designing for over 20 years. I can't garden all those gardens. And if they don't have gardeners, they're going to be, terrible, lost ideas. So you have to make gardeners, not gardens. And you make gardeners by using beauty to, lure people in. And it's in the eye of the beholder. So what's beautiful is different to everyone.
Yeah, that's really lovely. I love that idea. How do you see the discipline of garden design evolving over the coming decades, specifically in New Zealand and also more generally?
So garden design in New Zealand has really blossomed since I started out. Nobody even knew what it was when I announced that I was going to become a garden designer. My friends would say, well, could you mow my lawns? And I'm like, no, not really, but I'll recommend someone to you. And the idea of, because I guess our gardening tradition was really something we did ourselves. It was something, you did your own garden. You didn't have someone else come in and design it. And of course it was present here, but it just wasn't on the career list. Whereas now it is a really respected profession, and especially in terms of environmental responsibility and requirements. We used to be able to build, when I started out, and we had my team of other awesome young people, and we would just go around and we'd make and build whatever we wanted, and we never had to get consent for anything. And now people can't get consent for doing other things unless they have us on the job. And so it really has become far more of a respected profession in New Zealand. And I think some of that comes from the fact that our relationship with the land here is, we take it, it's really sacred to us, and so we're not such an urban environment that we're detached from that yet. So that's really awesome. We just had recently, a couple of years ago, we actually had a case where a river was given rights to have a legal entity, and so polluting the river is not allowed to happen, because the river has been granted its own legal entity as a life source which needs to be protected. And so there's like all that sort of thinking going on. But the other thing that's been really driving kind of, I guess, the respect for our profession is the understanding that being able to plan out landscape on significant scales is a really important skill going into a period where global warming is becoming more and more increasingly critical issue that people can't ignore. So being able to map and restore landscapes and having the knowledge and understanding to do that is becoming a highly valued skill in terms of future planning. And so it's no longer a kind of decorative aside, it's becoming an essential service in terms of the consequences of other things that you do. You need to remediate and kind of bring the balance up. There's also an understanding that monoculture approaches to that sort of thinking aren't as resilient and aren't as good at carbon sequestration as complex, diverse systems. And so well-trained people who understand how to make complex systems in a way that can be simplified and put into action are really, really valuable. And so that big scale landscape design ethos is utterly essential in terms of, how we're going to get an environment where we can kind of tip the balance back towards a hospitable place for humans.
I very much like the fact that concern for the environment underpins all of Xanthe's work, but that she doesn't shy away from the concept of beauty, because ultimately that's a large part of what garden design is about. And I think that sometimes in a world that's fraught with troubles, we can see beauty as frivolous, but it's not. It's an essential part of our lives. I'd like to say a very big thank you to Xanthe for taking part in the interview. Thank you to the London College of Garden Design for sponsoring this series, in which we've covered the 4 corners of the globe. If you haven't already listened, do go and check out episode 48 with Leon Kluger, 41 with Kim Wilkie, and 38 with Thomas Rayner, which are the 3 other episodes in the series. And please do take a look at the college's website, lcgd.org.uk. Thanks very much for listening, and I'll catch you all next Tuesday. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website www.rootsandall.co.uk, where you'll also find my blog and a sign-up form for the newsletter, which gives you a weekly roundup of content, plus the inside scoop on things like upcoming guests. Or you can subscribe wherever you normally get your podcasts. Email me with comments and feedback at podcast@rootsandall.co.uk. Follow me on Twitter, Roots and All, Facebook, Roots and All UK, and Instagram, Roots and All Pod. But please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support my work, because if you like what I do, please help me to continue doing it. Even if you make a one-off donation of £1, trust me, it all helps, and I will be immensely grateful. So please go to Patreon and search for Roots and All.